Thank you, Anne, and welcome everybody. It's such a beautiful, beautiful evening. Tonight we're going to go to one of the loveliest places on this beautiful planet of ours, to the islands of French Polynesia. If the world ever returns to normal, if face masks and social distancing can become a thing of the past, if the cruise line industry ever recovers from what has been a devastating 21-month experience, and if any one of us are ever inclined to take one cruise, this is the cruise to take. French Polynesia consists of 118 dormant and extinct volcanic islands in the South Pacific, spread out over an area the size of Western Europe. 9 of the islands we will visit tonight are contained within 3 of the 5 archipelagos of French Polynesia, where we will also meet some of the legendary explorers, artists, and writers who came to this lovely part of the world. We will first visit Tahiti, largest of the 118 islands. Then Moorea, the island that the writer James Mitchner christened Bali High. Bora-Bora, known as the most beautiful island in the world. This is Bora-Bora. We are inside the lagoon looking at the island. From here, we will go to Tetiaroa, the island home of Marlon Brando and his Tahitian lady love. And then on to Rangiroa, which is one of the largest atolls in the world. Then we will go to Nukuhiba, the island where Herman Melville jumped ship to live among the natives. And then off to Raiatea, the most sacred island in the Pacific, to Waihene, the largest concentration of outdoor temples, and finally to Ivaoa, where the French artist Paul Gauguin is buried. One of my favorite writers, he's out of fashion now, is James Mitchner. He was a young naval officer in the South Pacific during World War II. You may remember that after the war, he embarked on a career as a writer of a long line of monumental novels like Hawaii, which I distinctly remember reading in high school. However, the first of his 40 books was written in 1946 and won him a Pulitzer Prize in 1948. It was entitled Tales of the South Pacific. I have it here. I remember it's a little dog-eared after all these years. I took it with me when I went to the South Pacific as a young naval officer back in the late 60s. I wanted to read the first paragraph of this book. It is entitled The South Pacific. I wish I could tell you about the South Pacific, the way it actually was, the endless ocean, the infinite specks of coral we called islands, coconut palms nodding gracefully toward the ocean, reefs upon which waves broke into spray, and inner lagoons lovely beyond description. I wish I could tell you about the sweating jungle, the full moon rising behind the volcanoes, and the waiting, the timeless, repetitive waiting. But whenever I start to talk about the South Pacific, people intervene. I try to tell somebody what the steaming Hebrides were like, and the first thing you know, I'm telling them about the old Tonkinese woman who used to sell human heads as souvenirs for $50. Or somebody asks me, what was Guadalcanal actually like? And before I can describe that God-forsaken backwater of the world, I'm rambling on about the remittance man who lived among the enemy and sent on radio news of their movements. That he sent the news until one day he didn't. That captures for me some of the beauty of the South Pacific. But let us begin with the great waterway that takes us there, and that is the Great Pacific Ocean. The Pacific Ocean covers 1/3 of the Earth's surface and is the planet's single largest geographic feature. It holds 1/2 all the world's water. It's the largest of the 5 oceans, the other 4 being the Atlantic, the Indian, the Arctic, and the Antarctic. It's the most biologically diverse, the most seismically active, with the world's largest volcanoes, the tallest underwater mountains, and the deepest underwater trenches. It is, if a picture was worth 1,000 words, this is that picture. The Pacific Ocean is continentally large. It is large enough to hold all the continents of the world, with enough room left over for Greenland. This is one of the fascinating aspects about this body of water. A second aspect that's fascinating is that it is surrounded by a ring of fire. The name Pacific is actually a misnomer. It is not a peaceful body of water. It is bordered by 25,000 miles of seismic activity, approximately 450 active volcanoes. Tiny Guatemala in Central America has 37 active volcanoes. The Pacific is truly a ring of fire. From the tip of South America, up and around to the Bering Strait, down the coast of Russia and Asia to around Australia, 90% of the world's earthquakes take place in this ring of fire, often accompanied by terrible typhoons and deadly tsunamis. The distances are truly immense. We know that from Washington to Los Angeles is approximately 3,000 miles. But what we have here is 12,000 miles from Panama to Singapore, 9,000 miles from the Bering Strait down to the Antarctic Circle, across 64 million square miles of water. The world's greatest explorer, Captain James Cook, spent 12 years exploring the Pacific on 3 separate voyages, which we will see in a few moments. There was, during thousands and thousands of years ago, a great Pacific migration, a 7,000-year journey from Asia across the Pacific, reaching Tahiti in approximately 500 BC, moving on upward 800 years later to Hawaii in 300 AD, and then 700 years later down to New Zealand in about 1000 AD. There are 2 schools of thought on this migration. Most anthropologists believe that the Pacific migration was from west to east, from Asia into the Pacific. A small group believe that it was the other direction, from South America into the islands, and this includes the noted anthropologist Thor Heyerdahl. Those taking this voyage were truly nomads of the wind. They came in a variety of giant, specially built, double-hulled sailing canoes, hopscotching across the Pacific without any navigational aids and no knowledge of what lay over the horizon. Accompanied by only a few animals, pigs, dogs, and chickens, they navigated by wind, stars, cloud formations, and ocean currents. This was recently replicated by a rather remarkable voyage, the Voyage of the Hokulea. From 2014 to 2017, the Hokulea, a Tahitian double-hulled voyaging canoe, made a 3-year circumnavigation of the world, traveling over 47,000 nautical miles with no modern navigational equipment, piloted only by an elderly Tahitian navigator, using ancient Polynesian wayfinding techniques such as ocean currents, cloud formations, stars, and the wind. The Hokulea visited 26 countries and lodged itself in 85 ports around the world during their 3-month circumnavigation. The South Pacific is that area below the equator. It contains approximately 20 to 30,000 islands. Some are large island masses like New Zealand. Others just clusters of rocks and sandbars. The total population in the South Pacific is about 20 million people. Anthropologists have divided the South Pacific into 3 major areas, major island groups. The first that we see here in blue, which we will not be visiting in this lecture, is Melanesia, from the Greek for the Black Islands. The natives of these islands have a much darker hue. The 4 big island groups in Melanesia are Fiji, Vanuatu, Solomon, and Papua New Guinea. The second island group, which we see here in red, is Micronesia, from the Greek for little islands. Again, 4 island groups, many of which we learned about during the history of World War II, the Caroline Islands, the Gilberts, the Marianas, and the Marshalls. And the third, which is the area we're going to learn about this evening, is Polynesia, from the Greek for many islands. And here we will encounter what is called the Polynesian Triangle. This triangle has 3 points: Hawaii to the north, Easter Island to the southeast, and New Zealand to the southwest. Within this triangle are 15 major island groups, of which French Polynesia, with its 118 islands, is simply one of the 15 groups. Several are independent nations, such as New Zealand, Samoa, and Tonga. Others are overseas possessions of foreign nations. Chile, for example, owns Easter Island. Britain claims Pitcairn Island. France claims French Polynesia. Here we have a picture of French Polynesia. It consists of 5 major archipelagos, or island groups, spread over an area the size of Western Europe, totaling 118 islands. 67 are inhabited and 51 are uninhabited. To the north are the island groups of the Marquesas, and we will visit 2 islands here. We will visit Ivaoa, where Gogan is buried, and Nukuhiba, where To the middle, we see the Tuamotu Islands, and we will visit one of the largest atolls in the world, Rangiroa. And the others that we will visit will be in the Society Islands, Tahiti, Moorea, Bora-Bora, and a few others. Collectively, these 118 islands have a landmass the size of about Rhode Island. All are volcanic, dormant, and extinct. Their total population of the 67 inhabited islands is about 300,000, with almost 200,000 living on the island of Tahiti, in the capital city of Papeete. French Polynesia is a self-governing province of France, much like Hawaii is a state of the United States. The Polynesian migration within the triangle was captured beautifully by James Mitchner in the book Hawaii, where Polynesians from Tahiti leave for Hawaii. In Mitchner's telling, it is because of tribal politics, but also it might have been because of famine or great social stress. So within the triangle, migrating populations from Asia reached Tahiti in about 500 BC. Hawaii will be settled 800 years later, in about 300 AD, and New Zealand in about 1000 AD, just about the same time that the Vikings' invasions in Europe are transitioning into settlements in France, Britain, and Ireland. Europeans will first venture into the Pacific in the early 1500s and will visit Polynesia near the end of that century. As we will now see, the first of these adventurers will pay a heavy price for his daring. Ferdinand Magellan was born in 1480 in Portugal. By the age of 10, he was a young attendant at the royal court, and by the age of 25, he had been appointed viceroy of Goa on the west coast of India. Goa remained a province of Portugal up until 1961, when it was returned to India. Young Magellan returned in 1517 to Portugal to propose an expedition to the Spice Islands, the islands of Indonesia. There are about 17,000 islands in Indonesia. He proposed an expedition not around the African continent, but by traveling west. His 3-year voyage would establish Magellan as the first European to circumnavigate the world. But it would be marked by every kind of calamity: mutiny, ship loss, scurvy, starvation, and the captain's death. We see here the 3-year voyage. Magellan departed Spain in September 1519. He commanded 5 ships with a total crew of 240. He headed south and then west and made landfall at Rio de Janeiro in the modern-day country of Brazil. He sailed further south into the straits at the tip of South America, later to be named for him, the Straits of Magellan. Here he encountered ferocious winds, violent currents, lost 2 of his 5 ships, finally exited the straits and entered the calm waters, which he named El Mar Pacifico. He then headed west, crossed the equator, lost a 3rd ship, and in April 1521 reached the Philippines, 18 months after having left Spain. Unfortunately, he encountered hostile natives, which was to be the case with many of the explorers, and he was killed in a battle with them. It was there that one of the two remaining ships decided to turn back and was never heard from again. But the other, the flagship Victoria, journeyed into the Spice Islands, loaded up, then continued on around Africa and headed home, reaching Spain in September 1522, 3 years after its departure, with 26 tons of spices, but only 18 of the original crew of 240. The voyage was declared a great success. We have here Alvaro de Mendana. If Magellan is credited with having circumnavigated the world, Mendana is credited with twice having circumnavigated not the world, but the Pacific. Twice and 30 years apart. And more important to our story, he is the first European explorer into the islands of French Polynesia. We see here in red Mendana's first voyage in 1567, 45 years after Magellan's flagship had returned to Spain. This circumnavigation of the Pacific takes Mendana to the Solomon Islands, Guadalcanal, the Marshall Islands, and the Hawaiian Islands. On his second trip, seen here in blue 30 years later, from 1595 to 96, his aim was to colonize the Solomons, but he was not successful. He is the first European to visit French Polynesia, the Marquesas Islands to be exact. We come now to what many historians consider the greatest explorer ever, Captain James Hook. The Smithsonian must agree with this because next March they have scheduled 5 lectures on Captain James Cook and his 3 voyages. Captain Cook spent 12 years sailing and exploring the Pacific on 3 separate 4-year voyages. As we will see shortly, the first one was a voyage of discovery, the second one a voyage of exploration, and the third one a voyage of disappointment. The first voyage, which we see here in the red line, was from 1768 to 1771. This is the Voyage of Discovery. He was initially given a set of orders from the Admiralty in London to proceed to a spot in the South Pacific to map the transit of the planet Venus across the sun. He was not successful because it was a cloudy day. But then he was ordered to unwrap his secret instructions, and those instructions ordered him to discover new areas in the Pacific. This led to his discovery of New Zealand and Australia. He is the first European to land on the continent of Australia, the first Englishman to circumnavigate the globe on his way home, where he arrived as a hero to the scientific community in London for the many discoveries that he brought back with him. The Admiralty ordered him to do a second voyage. This is the green line, from 1772 to 1775. He was directed to explore the South Pacific and to circumnavigate Antarctica, thus disproving a long-held theory that there was a Pacific continent in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. He will, on this voyage, visit Easter Island, Norfolk Island, and New Caledonia. In the third voyage, the blue line, This is the Voyage of Disappointment. He has been directed to seek a northwest passage, much like Lewis and Clark would be directed by President Jefferson a few years later. He explored the western coast of Canada, Alaska, Bering Strait, but there was no Northwest Passage. But he did discover the Hawaiian Islands. Unfortunately, what happened to him happened to several others as well, and that is he died in battle with the natives. One of his contemporaries was a gentleman by the name of Samuel Wallis, who also made 3 voyages to the Pacific. Like Magellan and Cook, he also circumnavigated the globe. But his claim to fame for our story is that he was the first European to land in Tahiti in June of 1767. He sought to claim it for Britain, but alas, there was no follow-up by the government. Instead, this gentleman, Louis-Antoine de Bougainville, was the successful claimant for France. He arrived in Tahiti just a few months after Samuel Wallis. But because he later published his journals and crafted a story of Tahiti as a tropical paradise, there was an influx of French missionaries, administrators, and settlers to the island. Louis-Antoine de Bougainville later participated in the American Revolution. He fought at the naval battle at Yorktown under Admiral Rochambeau, whose statue sits in Jackson Park, just across the street from the White House. And after his retirement, he was appointed not only an admiral, but a senator, and later a count by Napoleon. Over the years, 13 French warships have been named in his honor, along with the beautiful flower and the island of Bougainville off Papua New Guinea. And now we are off to Tahiti, largest of the 118 islands of French Polynesia. In fact, the largest landmass for over 1,000 miles in any direction. It is actually one huge, dormant, volcanic crater, 40 miles long with numerous valleys running down to the seashore, with an isthmus separating the main island from a small little island, but with a single lagoon around both. It is called by many names. We see it here as Great Tahiti of the Golden Haze, but it is also known as the Land of the Double Rainbow. It has a population of almost 200,000, and it is the heart of French Polynesia. This is Papeete, the capital of French Polynesia. 70% of the population of 270,000 people live here. This is where the cruise ships dock and the international flights arrive at the airport, usually as the sun is rising in the morning, always an unforgettable sight. The French influence is everywhere. Most Tahitians speak French. French tourists often remain to live and work, since French Polynesia is part of the French Republic. This is the waterfront, lovely for strolling at any time of day. The botanical garden there in the center is beautiful. It is dedicated to Louis-Antoine de Bougainville and has a number of pools filled with koi, turtles, and eels. It is a magnificent botanical garden of plants and lily pads, and the cafe nearby is perfect for your morning coffee and croissant. This is the view of Moorea, the island that a Mitchner called Waihene, in the distance. It is taken from the Intercontinental Tahiti Resort and Spa. It is just across the water. And you may remember Waihene from the Broadway play, as well as the 1958 musical, South Pacific, which is based on Mitchner's Tales of the South Pacific. We see here Mitzi Gaynor as Ensign Nellie Forbush and Rosanna Brasi as plantation owner Emile de Beck. We'll come back to Moorea in a moment, but first a few of the sights that need to be seen in Tahiti. The first is its museum, the Museum of Tahiti and its Islands. It is only 10 minutes from downtown, and it's worth a full day of your time and attention. Most people coming for a cruise around the islands usually arrive 2 or 3 days early in order to avail themselves of time on the island of Tahiti. This is probably the first place that people are directed to go, because here you will have a comprehensive overview of Polynesian geology, history, and culture. For example, how volcanoes formed islands, atolls, and lagoons. How Polynesians built seagoing canoes without nails and with no metal tools. How they wandered the Pacific without any navigational gear. Everything is explained in detail at this wondrous museum. The stone structure that you see there is replicated throughout the islands of French Polynesia. It is a religious platform, much like what might be called a temple without a building on top of it. It is called a marae. A second place that you might like to visit is James Norman Hall's home and museum. If the name is somewhat familiar, it's because he is the co-author with Charles Nordhoff, co-author of Mutiny on the Bounty, with the infamous Captain Bligh and the leader of the mutineers, Fletcher Christian. Hollywood has made 3 movies of the story, with Fletcher Christian played by Clark Gable, Marlon Brando, and Mel Gibson. James Norman Hall's home has been restored to reflect his 30 years living in Tahiti from 1920 to 1950, and his remarkable library of over 3,000 books. Speaking of Marlon Brando, we see him here with the Tahitian co-star, that is the island of Bora-Bora in the background. And he married his co-star, and they bought a small little island just a little bit north of Tahiti called Tetiaroa, where they raised their children. After their deaths, it was sold to an expensive resort. This is not on the cruise line voyage, but it's so beautiful that I wanted to make sure that we all had a chance to see it. One of the other spots that is so nice to visit is the Gogan Museum. He is probably the most famous individual to come to Tahiti. The museum details his 10 years of life in Tahiti and Hivaoa, where he is buried. The museum contains many of his mementos, letters, photos, engravings, and reproductions, but none of his paintings, since they are much too valuable. One recently sold for $300 million. And speaking of Paul Gauguin, perhaps we should take a little side tour of his life. He was born in Paris in 1848, but spent his childhood in Peru, where his grandfather was president. He had an idyllic childhood there in a tropical paradise, which may account for his later travels both to the French island of Martinique in the Caribbean, as well to his 10 years in Tahiti. He returned to France as a teenager and went to school and became a merchant marine officer, and later became a stockbroker in Paris. He married and had 5 children. He left Paris after the 1880 stock market crash and went to live with his in-laws in Denmark. He was there for 5 years and returned to Paris in 1885 to become an artist. He became friends with the early Impressionists, Pissarro, Cézanne, and Van Gogh. You may remember the movie Lust for Life. Kirk Douglas starred as Vincent van Gogh and Anthony Quinn as Gogan. Quinn won an Academy Award for his performance as Best Supporting Actor in that movie. Gogan will go to Tahiti in 1891 and spend 2 years there. He leaves his family behind. His first painting has an interesting story behind it. Apparently, he saw a lovely Tahitian woman walking down in native garb, and he wanted to capture her, so he asked if she would pose for him as his model. She said she would, but she had to go home first. And when she reappeared in European dress because she thought that's how she should be shown. We all know that he would paint wonderful works, very colorful and exotic. This particular painting, Fatata Te Biti, painted in 1892, you can see today at the National Gallery of Art here in Washington. He will return to Paris in 1893 after his 2-year stay in Papeete, and he will have with him 70 canvases, and he takes the art world by storm and puts Tahiti on the map. He stays in Paris for 2 years with his family, but has a falling out with the critics and the gallery owners of Paris, and finally decides to return. This is the painting I mentioned earlier that sold for $300 million. When will you marry? Gogan will return to Tahiti, never to go back to France, never to see his wife and 5 children again. He will live in French Polynesia for the remaining 8 years of his life, devoting himself to painting, sculpture, and wood prints, sending his material back to Paris where it continues to sell to support his wife and children. But Gogan is in search of more primitive locales and lifestyles, and he heads north, leaving Tahiti in 1900 for the far distant island of Ivaoa in the Marquesas archipelago. Here he will continue his work, which continues to sell well in Paris. And during his 3 years in Ivaoa, he will drift into dissolution, living off and on and in and out of marriage with teenage girls and having children by them. He will die at the age of 55 in 1903 and is buried on the island of Ivaoa, and this is his grave. We are still in Tahiti. We have not left. That was just the museum that I wanted to point out, which led me into a discussion of Gogan, since it is the Gogan Museum. One place that you will want to visit is the Pearl Museum. And this is in downtown Papeete. Here, a visitor is treated to the fascinating history of pearls. This is French Polynesia's second largest industry after tourism. If pearls are your love, Tahiti is the place to go. And now we cross the water to Moorea. It's a short distance. The island James Mitchner called Bali High. Moorea is what is called a cloud-catching island. Its 8 mountains soar majestically out of the sea, capturing the passing clouds in their peaks, creating the rainfall which gives a palette of various shades of green and blue to the island and the surrounding lagoon. Moorea was settled 1,000 years ago, and today has a population of 16,000, the second largest in French Polynesia, with a small seaside towns scattered around. Your cruise ship will enter Cook's Bay, named for the great Captain James Cook, who visited here in 1769. It is one of the 2 magnificent entrances to the island, the other with the lovely sounding name of Oponohu Bay was the actual bay that Cook entered. Here we clearly see the opening or the mouth of a dormant volcano off to the right. Moorea is known for its magical mountaintops. You will take a jeep journey around the island, always going higher and higher until you reach one of the high points where you can see both Cook Bay to the left and Oponohu Bay to the right. It is one of those magical moments when one is mesmerized by nature's magnificent surroundings, perhaps like the Garden of Eden before the fall. For the adventurous and the truly intrepid souls on your journey, who may desire a close-up of whale watching, there are underwater guides who will take you where the whales are. Prime season is July to October. For the tourist who is much less of an adventurer, he can stay at the Moorea Dolphin Center and see the spectacle there, located at the Intercontinental Moorea Resort. We now come to the most beautiful island in the world, Bora-Bora, named so by the Tahitians themselves. It is an hour plane ride from Tahiti, and it is unquestionably, almost blindingly magnificent. Once again, an artist's palette of various shades of blue in its lagoon and ocean, mixed with lovely shades of green in its mountains and valleys. There's a fascinating historical note about this island. On December 7th, 1941, a date that would live in infamy when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, the United States Navy suddenly realized how exposed the west coast of the United States would be to a Japanese invasion. And one of the first things it did was to send 6,000 sailors and Marines to Bora-Bora. And their mission was to build airfields and place gun installments there. And this they did, and those are still in existence. Several people we met on one of the 4 trips we took to French Polynesia were there because their grandfather had served on Bora-Bora. And as you sail around the island, you can see these gun installations pointing up at the sky. This is another view where you see ocean, reef, atoll, lagoon, and island. And you also see the thatched huts of the resorts there. The beach bungalows of the various resorts. There is only one town on the island of Bora-Bora. It is the town of Vaitaipe, with a population of 6,000. It is a dropping off point for visitors from cruise ships. It is here that you can take lagoon excursions. A variety are available: catamaran, outrigger canoes, jet boats, jet skis, but the best is a simple 3-hour motorboat ride around the entire island, with stopping off points for wading and swimming, with the island constantly changing shape as you circle it. Above and below are fascinating creatures. Sharks and stingrays are often present in the water. But the real danger, believe it or not, in Polynesia, the one they warn you about, the one that they want to make sure you're aware of, is falling coconuts. Be careful not to walk under those huge coconut trees, because if one falls on you, you probably are gone. One afternoon, when my lovely wife Katie and I were walking with a group of friends, that's exactly what happened. Fortunately, it fell about 10 yards from us, but it made such a tremendous sound because full coconuts are very heavy. There are these luxurious resorts on Bora-Bora. This is the Four Seasons Bora-Bora Resort. Another one that we saw a little moment ago, this is the Intercontinental Bora-Bora. And you can see here, the ocean is at the bottom, the reef, the lagoon, the shades of the lagoon, and the greenness of the island. It's just beautiful. From Bora-Bora, we head to another archipelago, the Tuamotu archipelago, where we come upon Rangiroa. Not an island like Tahiti or Bora-Bora, but the second largest atoll in the world. The oldest, largest is in Kwajalein. All of the island of Tahiti could be put in the middle of this atoll. You could climb to the mountain top of Tahiti and see the sunrise out of the lagoon and set in the lagoon in the evening. That is how large this atoll is. What is an atoll? Up close, this is what it looks like. The atoll here consists of 240 small islets in a great circle. Rangiroa was once an active volcano that became dormant, and as it slowly sank into the water, the volcano disappears, but the edges come up on the side where the reef is built, and coral begins to grow on the outer edge. And with the rainfall becoming water in the lagoon and the ocean outside, and finally the volcano will sink and disappear completely, leaving just the coral bed of the lagoon and becoming the atoll we see today. On the atoll of Rangiroa, when you arrive, you can walk and rent a bicycle and go for a long ride with the ocean on one side and the lagoon on the other. And you will eventually come to this resort at Kiaora. Here you can watch what I think is one of the most beautiful things in the world, which is inside the restaurant at Kiaora. You will be sitting on a glass floor watching the marine life underneath you. It's mesmerizing. From Rangiroa, we head further north to Nukuhiba. It is the second largest island in French Polynesia, and like its neighbor Ivaoa, the resting place of Paul Gauguin, it is located in the far distant Marquesa archipelago. Your cruise ship will enter and anchor in the bay, which is actually the sunken crater of an extinct volcano. The mountains soar up all along the side as you sit there quietly rocking at anchor. It is a beautiful island, which may explain why Herman Melville, author of the great novel Moby Dick, jumped ship here in 1842 to live among the natives. Herman Melville was born in 1819 into a prominent New England family in which both of his grandparents had fought in the Revolutionary War. He was educated to be a teacher, but found that a little bit boring and decided to go to sea. He spent 5 years at sea on merchant ships, whaling ships, and Navy ships, and in 1842 jumped ship here to live among the natives. Based on his adventures in Nukuhiba and later in Tahiti and Moorea, he returned to New York in 1845 and embarked on a writing career, and his first novel was Taipei. Introduced his readers to the wonderful island adventures, lovely native girls, and fierce cannibals. It sold well enough for him to write a sequel. But in 1850, at the age of 30, he wrote his masterpiece, Moby Dick. It was based on 2 actual whaling events in the South Pacific. The first in 1820, when a Nantucket whaler, the Essex, was sunk by a giant sperm whale off the Galapagos Islands. The Hollywood director, Ron Howard, recently made a movie of this. It is entitled In the Heart of the Sea. And in 1840, there is the true story of Moby Dick, a giant white whale that repeatedly attacked whaling ships off the coast of Chile. In Hollywood's version of Moby Dick, Gregory Peck starred as Captain Ahab. Of course, Melville was not the only writer to be entranced by his stay in Polynesia. There was one young writer who would become one of England's most famous war poets, along with other greats. Rupert Brooke was born in 1887, the year of Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee, her 50 years on the throne, when the sun never set on the British Empire. Rupert Brooke was educated at King's College, Cambridge, and welcomed into high society in London, where he was often called the handsomest young man in England. He became part of the Bloomsbury literary set with friends such as Virginia Woolf, D.H. Lawrence, and Maynard Keynes. He became friends with Winston Churchill and Prime Minister Asquith. He delayed a teaching position at Cambridge for a year of travel. And in 1914, he arrived in Tahiti. He settled in the same part of town where Gauguin had once lived, in a house with a wide veranda overlooking the lagoon, and promptly fell in love with Ta'ata Mata. He wrote poetry about her and was happy in Tahiti, but he felt impelled to return to England as the war was breaking out in August of 1914. He was commissioned a naval officer and sent to a ship off the Dardanelles, where he died shortly before the assault on Gallipoli. He was buried on the Greek island of Skyros. Winston Churchill gave his eulogy, and the Dean of St. Paul Cathedral in London read the following poem, written by Rupert Brooke. If I should die, think only this of me, that there's some corner of a foreign field that is forever England. There shall be in that rich earth a richer dust concealed, a dust whom England bore, shaped, made aware, gave once her flowers to love, her ways to roam, a body of England's breathing English air, and washed by the rivers, blessed by the sons of home. And think this heart all evil shed away, a pulse in the eternal mind no less, lives somewhere back the thoughts by England given, her sights and sounds, dreams happy as her day, and laughter learnt of friends and gentleness, in hearts at peace under an English heaven. When he died, he had just received a letter from Ta'ata Mata asking when he would be returning. Before we leave Nukuhiba, there is one item unique to the island, or perhaps I should say to Nukuhiba and the Marquesas Islands, and that is the Tiki Idols. They would eventually spread north to Hawaii and become associated with the culture of French Polynesia. The mystic mountains of Nukuhiba are beautiful, the jungles and the mountains, but it was here that the coconut fell, and we were reminded how dangerous it is. Onward we go to Raiatea. If Bora-Bora is the most beautiful island in the world, Raiatea is the most sacred island in the South Pacific. From here, Polynesians went north to Hawaii and south to New Zealand. The island is home to the most sacred temples in French Polynesia. It also boasts the second largest town after Papeete. This is a beautiful shot of Uturoa, the capital of Raiatea, where one can see that we are inside the lagoon with the ocean outside, protected by the reef. Uturoa is a charming town with a population of about 12,000. Perfect for strolling everywhere and having lunch at restaurants with islands in the distance. And it does rain, and on those rainy days, you can always find an indoor market with exotic and unusual items of all sorts. The last island on our cruise is Waihene. It is really two islands connected by a bridge with a deep, crystal clear lagoon, perfect for a 3-hour catamaran ride, a little snorkeling, and light lunch. There are also a variety of beach bungalows in case you might like to just stay over for a day or two, or visit the large concentration of outdoor temples, the Moorea that I mentioned before. There are almost over 200 of these throughout Waihene. It's not exactly the Parthenon, but it is what it is. And then finally, you will leave. You will return to Papeete. You will fly home. A day or two later, you will find yourself in rush hour traffic. And you will be sitting there and you'll be thinking, I wonder what rush hour in Tahiti or French Polynesia is like. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you, and I'd be happy to try to answer any questions that you may have.
Did anyone have any questions that you'd like to pass?
If anybody would like to be a lecturer on a cruise ship, do drop me a line. Be happy to tell you how it can be done. And you may be surprised that they're always looking for lecturers. Who bought the $300 million painting by Gogan? Who will I marry? I don't know who bought that painting, but I have a feeling that if you Google it, you will find out, since everything is now available on Google.
How long is the trip from here to Tahiti?
You will fly from Dulles to San Francisco. You will walk through San Francisco's airport forever to get to the terminal that is going to fly you to Papeete. It is probably an 8-hour flight to Tahiti. You will arrive at sunrise, as I mentioned. It is simply magnificent as you come in. By the time you land, get your luggage, it will be pouring rain. But you will be grateful that you can jump into a taxi cab and go to the Intercontinental hotel, and that you will have reserved your thatched hut over the water, and you will have an opportunity to see, I think, one of the most beautiful places in the world. It is drop-dead gorgeous. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you